Daily reminder, meme tanks are fun tanks. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/35th scale US T40 GMC. The model in this video is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, as I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. This model is built predominantly out of the box. However, I went ahead and enhanced the model further by polishing up and improving several of the kit supply details. In this video, I'm going to be giving this model a thorough in-box review. I'm also going to be going over the various detailed mods that were made to the model to enhance it to the condition that you see here. And I'm also going to be mentioning several aspects of the build to watch out for that will help you if you encounter a kit like this in your travels. So with all that out of the way, there's going to be a lot of info coming at you, so just sit back and relax and enjoy the show. To start this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this model here is the US T40 GMC, or gun motor carriage. And although it is the T40, technically it's not really the T40, but we'll go into that in a moment. The T40 was an experimental gun motor carriage that was developed by the US military during the early phases of World War II, specifically 1941 to the 1942 timeframe. At this time, the US Armored Corps would have been comprising of a light tank, a medium tank, and a heavy tank. For light tank duty, this was relegated to the M3. Stuart specifically. For the medium tank, this would have been the M3 Lee, and later on the M4 Sherman. And for the heavy tank at the period, it would have been the M6. There were also two forms of self-propelled artillery, namely the M7 Priest with its 105, as well as the M12 with its 155. For the use of a tank, this was primarily intended for infantry support, where if you come across an emplacement, be a pillbox or some other type of a fortification, the armament of the tank should have sufficient HE capabilities to deal with it. Also, in case a tank were to emerge on scene, the main armament should be able to deal with that threat as well. And for the medium tank role, the 75mm proved to be quite adequate for this, specifically at this time. However, if there was a need where the enemy was attacking with armor en masse, or you run into a vehicle with heavy armor on it that the 75 wasn't really going to be suitable at dealing with, well, you're left with a pickle. This generally would be dealt with artillery like the M7 or the M12. However, those units are intended for indirect fire use, and what was needed was a vehicle that was solely intended for use with knocking out enemy armor, while using direct fire specifically. With US Army nomenclature, they would refer to this as a gun motor carriage. However, it's also commonly referred to as a tank destroyer. And to fit the bill, the first vehicle, or one of the first vehicles that was developed by the Ordnance Corps, was the T40. The T40 was simple enough. They're taking an existing platform, i.e. a chassis, and mounting on a heavy ordnance, specifically to deal with armor threats. Because of this, several design cues were made to the vehicle in order to suit this role more efficiently. And this was a pretty sound idea, and is one that was used by all the major powers during the war. For the T40, the chassis that was chosen was the M3 Lee, as again, this was in production and in service at the time, so maintenance and parts commonality was very good. What was done was the body and the hull of the M3 was modified, where the sponson mounted 75, as well as all the provisions for the turret, were completely ripped out, the roof was removed, and the hull was modified to mount on a new piece of ordnance. And originally the T40 would have had a M3 anti-aircraft gun. The use of an anti-aircraft gun is a smart one because the idea is pretty solid. If you need to have a ordnance that can lob a shell into the sky, you need to have a lot of muzzle velocity. Well, that muzzle velocity is going to be really handy when pointed horizontally because it has some pretty good effects on penetrating armor. The conversion work was simple enough and was done by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Pennsylvania. The vehicle was then sent back to Aberdeen for testing and evaluation, and Ordnance Corps tested it, but for one reason or another, they decided to can the project, and the vehicle then disappeared, or was more than likely scrapped after that. The ordnance, however, of the T40 was improved further, and this unit would eventually wind up in the M10 tank destroyer, which was going to come shortly down the road. As I mentioned before, this vehicle is the T40. However, this is a fictional version of this vehicle, and this is because of the armament. Rather than featuring the proper 3-inch anti-aircraft armament, this one utilizes the 75mm pack howitzer. The pack howitzer was widely utilized and experimented with during the war years by the US military, and having this setup is actually one that's fairly plausible, although it is admittedly fictional. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when the model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this 1/35 scale resin 3D printed T40 US Tank Destroyer kit from SS Model. This model here is a very recent addition to the stash. I picked it up about 3 or 4 weeks ago, so it hasn't exactly been sitting in the shop for very long, nor has it picked up any dust, but somehow, magically, it does have some dust on the surface. Go figure. Regardless, this model here was procured off of eBay from the vendor listed below, as were all the other SS tank models that I've brought on video in the past and also in the future. I do have quite a number of these kits already in my collection, and I don't see a end coming soon because they always are producing some very interesting kits, and they're just really, really well engineered models overall, which of course you'll see once I crack the box open. These models here are made all out of a 3D print material, but it is a resin 3D print, so it's not filament based, and because of that, the surface quality is actually quite good on these models here. These models here are fairly affordable. I picked this one up anywhere between about 40 to about 50 some odd US dollars plus shipping, and overall that's also a pretty good price for a model of this size and also of this complexity. The kits are something that you are going to be purchasing online. If you're the boomer type of individual that will refuse to go on eBay or Amazon, or you like to walk into the brick and mortar store, you're not exactly going to see these models stocked unless you have a really top-end hobby shop. And if that's the case, I still doubt you're going to see these models stocked. These are really, really cool, and the best part is they are extremely easy to come by, with the caveat that you go on eBay in order to place your order. The models come in. This one here, I already opened it up just to double check if there's any mishaps with it, as I have run into that in the past. This one here, spoiler alert, it's actually in perfect condition. You will see that once I crack the box open. But if there is a problem with the printer, if it comes in damaged, you can just write or email and contact the vendor, and they will graciously help you out, sending you the proper replacement parts. And this was something that happened to me on a past build from the same company. But enough of that, let's go ahead and crack this box open. So like with all the other SS model kits, the box art and graphic design is very, very rudimentary. This is something akin to what I remember seeing back in the 90s with the old garage resin cast kits from companies like Accurate Armor and Commander and things along those lines. The box art is nothing more than a little illustration here of the CAD rendering of the vehicle in question, which is of course the T40 Tank Destroyer with the Pack 75. 3D printed, and basically what you see is what you get. There is the SS Models logo, in case anyone is interested. And this same kit, by the way, is offered in a multitude of different scales. This one here is a 135, but they also have it in 148, and I believe also 172, if I'm not mistaken. Regardless, just check out their eBay store, and they have everything there, which is easily found while navigating on their site. So, cracking the box open. First, the box is a nice, thick, chunky little box over here. It's good quality stock. Here we have basically a breakdown of the parts in question, which is a whopping 3, or I should say 3 items that are printed out. That's the other thing about these SS model kits. They tend to have a lot of components integrally printed on the model, which cuts down on the parts count, which in turn simplifies the build. Here we have some little bit more verbiage. This is more than I've seen on the other SS model kits I've bought in the past. And we see some of the other things they have in their lineup, which means they are spreading. So here we have the invoice. I don't want to dox myself, so you can see here the amount of money that was paid on the model. Like I stated before, it was about 50 some odd US dollars, but it's not uncommon for this vendor to actually have a lot of sales and price reductions throughout the week, or they offer special offers, so you can get the model for actually less most times than the actual listed price that you'll find online, which is a good thing. Here we have the instruction sheet. This one actually gives you an instruction sheet, which is not something that was done on the other ones. So very simple type printed sheet right here. There you go. It is a whopping 3-part assembly. So
It's really all you need to know. This is going to be a fairly quick build. It is, but I am going to be adding some extra upgrades to it that you'll see once I dig into the build. So the model's packed in this black foam spongy stuff over here, which does a decent job with keeping everything where it needs to be. Everything else is wrapped in bubble wrap. So let's go ahead and start with the biggest printing, which is the hull. By the way, everything is 3D printed in this flesh-colored resin material, which was seen on the other examples that I've built in the past. So this one here looks like it's suffered a little bit of damage. However, the damage that appears that it suffered was just from the printing sprues, so it needs to be snipped off anyway. However, from what I can tell, everything looks like it's in good shape. Let's carefully take this out of the bag. All right. So yeah, it looks like, shake anything out. Is there anything important? Nope, it just looks like printing girders. So as you can see, they really like this whole geometric girder type support system, which is kind of interesting. And like I said in the other video, I like to keep these because they kind of look like trusses, and you know, they're good for other things like terrain layouts or dioramas or things along those lines. So here you get to see the model surface. Like I stated before, the quality of the print is very, very good. It's very smooth. You don't see any print lines or anything along those lines, for lack of a better term. Just like with the T6, has some very nice underhull detailing over here with the rivets nicely pronounced, and the 3-piece transmission cover is also nicely printed. It even has the little Zerk fitting sections on either side, which is a nice touch. On the back section, we have the idler mounts integrally printed along with the pepper pot exhaust system, which would be appropriate for a vehicle of this pattern. We even have the taillights integrally printed on. Note they are just standard like bulb detailing. They do not have the appropriate cat's eye, which was again something that I mentioned on the T6 example. And basically this kit here is very similar in quality to the T6. And if everyone saw that video, thank you. But also, you know, you're going to be getting basically the same type of end result, which is awesome. I love that kit. And in that video, I went ahead and addressed this, and I'll be definitely doing that again for this one here. We have some grab handles integrally printed on, which is nice. They're nice in scale. You don't have to worry about fiddling with tweezers or anything along those lines, and they are present on both sides. And on this example here, they are not broken. They're in perfect shape. On the top deck here, we have some tools integrally printed on. We even have the tow cable sections, and on the other example I actually had to fabricate the tow cable detailing out of a little piece of string. On this one here, I'm not sure if they actually give you a little bit of string or cable to go with it, but we'll see as the unboxing continues. Also on the other one, there is no photo etch for the grill, so this is something that you are going to be on the hook of supplying yourself if you choose to do so. The remaining of the detailing definitely has the M3 Lee upper hull dead to rights. It's got all the appropriate rivets where they need to be. It's got the visors right here on either side, and it does have the little shield here for the armament. This being an open top vehicle does have some interior detailing, although it's a little tricky to see with all of this girders in the way. This is something that's definitely going to be coming to better light as the video goes on, and I trim and carefully move all this crap out of the way. But, you know, it's all there for a reason, and it's there to hold everything up. The driver section, looks like there is a rudimentary driver section right there. You can see the seat. Not sure if the transmission detailing is fully rendered out, but we'll see once I actually dig into this section here and remove all of these trusses. The headlights are also really nicely detailed. And again, this thing here should paint very well. One interesting quirk I can see is that this one here, the headlight is rendered with a dome, while this one here, it is sunk in. That's something a little interesting to point out. Does it really change anything in the grand scheme of things? Not really, but it's a data point I just wanted to reference. The tools are really nicely rendered. Nice and crisp. The shovel does have this little geometric shape to it. That's something I'm going to polish down. That should be curved. Those aren't boxy like that. And it is missing the pickaxe handle, or I should say the pickaxe head. It has the handle over here rendered, but not the pickaxe itself, which is interesting. The side skirts are, or I should say the tin work is nicely rendered out. It's a bit on the chunky end because, again, this file was originally, I believe, designed for 172, and they just bumped it up to the larger scales. And on something 172nd scale, this would be normal. 135, this is something that could use a bit of improvement, but overall, it's not a problem. On the front transmission cover over here, you see it's absent the final drives, as well as the idler mount is also absent some detailing over there. This is akin to something that you generally see on smaller scale models. Setting this guy aside takes us to the next runner, or next parts bag, I should say. And you know what, I'll go to the largest component, which is the suspension. So, just like with the T6 Sherman, this vehicle here has an all-encompassing suspension where the track, the bogies, the idler, and the sprocket all integrally printed on. And on this example over here, it appears that it is actually replicating that of a M3 Lee or a Sherman pattern of track, which means the track is wider. One of the quirks on the T6 was that they gave you the track from the M2 medium tank, and the two have different widths of track, which visually they look the same, just the width is slightly narrower on the M2. On this one over here, it's a bit interesting in that they rendered this track far too loose. It seems that whoever was designing this kit, if I was to take a guess, must have been looking at the example of that M4, the first production M4A1 that's housed in the Bovington tank collection named Michael. And if you look at that tank, the track isn't properly set. It's a bit on the loose end, and it has basically the look that we have here with the extra slack. On a T34, or I should say not a T34, on a KV or a Stalin, this would be par for the course. On a Sherman pattern vehicle, not as much. Shermans like to have their tension to be a little bit on the tighter end. If you have something like this, it'll tend to throw. Unfortunately, because the track is integrally printed on as one piece, this is an all or nothing type affair, and you're either going to keep these tracks or you're just going to replace them outright. And if you're going to replace them outright, you're going to need a replacement M3 Lee bogie suspension. So most people probably kit bash something together. Me, I hate doing that. I hate scavenging one kit to build another one. I just hate doing that. I'd rather make a mold of something and copy it than definitely do a scavenge approach, or unless it's spare parts. That's a different story. But you are going to need an M3 Lee suspension. I believe on eBay you can find the suspension sold separately from the Mini Art M3 Lee kits. I've seen a few vendors selling those loose on the market. And the track can be anything from Mini Art to a single piece vinyl track from AFV Club, or take your pick of any number of workable track links on the market. Is that something that's worth it? That's, again, up to discretion of the builder. Depends what you're going for. On my example over here, I think I'm going to keep these tracks with the slack on them, but I do obviously understand that the tracks generally on these Sherman patterns tend to be a bit more on the tauter side. As for the tracks themselves, one thing about the T6 that I learned was that this is literally the hardest part of the build, not so much with assembly, but with painting. This is the build right here. This is definitely going to be an exercise in paintwork, specifically precision paintwork. On tracks like this, it's a real pain in the ass to go ahead and get them thoroughly painted. You have to, specifically on a vehicle like an M3 Lee or a Sherman, where you have parts made out of rubber and parts made out of metal, and then you have to weather and paint everything accordingly. This is always why on my builds, the tracks are some of the last components to get assembled at the very tail end of the build. For reasons like that, it just makes paintwork a hell of a lot easier to do it off the model as opposed to doing it when it's pre-installed, which it's always bonkers when I see people doing that. One guy even wrote that on my OTR Yak Panther video, which I gotta say right now, if you're watching this, that's a bonkers idea. If I would have went ahead and did that before it's painted, it would have been a pain in the ass to paint. So yeah, no, I'd rather just do it the way I did, and the end result was excellent. That was a very beautiful model, and I stand by it. Regardless, this one over here, I have done, again, the T6 in the past, and is it doable? It's definitely doable, but it is, again, the hardest aspect of the entire model. The rest of the model's cake. This is the real work right here, and I'm overemphasizing it. It's actually fairly straightforward. It's just tedious. You have to go in there, carefully paint everything with a paintbrush. As a quick spoiler alert, don't install the tracks before the model's painted. And you'll see why as the video goes on. But regardless, as for the detailing on the tracks themselves, while the VVSS housings face-wise resemble more of the M2 with these little supports that we have integrally molded on, there may be some M3s out there that had those. It's a little rusty on the M3, but I believe that was the case. There were some castings in this manner. And these these printings here should be more than suffice for the job. They do have the hollow spoke row wheel as well as the idler wheel. Everything is nicely detailed as they were on the T6, and the sprocket is also very nicely detailed as well. The tracks are acceptable in terms of detail fidelity. As you can see, they definitely looked apart. The teeth are missing the little hollow intersection, as if anyone looked at a real Sherman track tooth from the VVSS, it has a little scallop section on the center, and they are absent here on the model that you see. Again, something like this is more akin to a smaller scale build as opposed to something on 135. The bigger you go, the more small detailing like that tends to be important. But they did factor in the little fastener found here on the end connector teeth. So for what it is, the track is, in my opinion, acceptable detail-wise. Moving on to the very last bits of components that are 3D printed. It's in this very nice armored and protected little box that we have here. And this here is the pack howitzer, the 75mm pack. And it is in a single all-encompassing 3D print. So the carriage, the breech, the cover, even the optic, everything is an integral print, which makes assembly of this thing ridiculously easy, which, you know, it's a good thing, specifically when you're as busy as I am. The crank wheel is all there, so is the elevation wheel. Now, I'm not sure how accurate this is, as I stated before in the spinning portion, or the walk-around portion of this model. The real vehicle utilized a much larger caliber armament. This one here, it's more akin to the video game where you start off with a tier 1 and you have to, you know, grind endlessly to get something that's better than a pea shooter. And that is basically the version that's replicated here. But it's kind of cool because I always did like the look of the 75mm pack howitzer. As far as I know, or as far as I've seen on the catalog, this is the only option of this vehicle that was produced, and they have not made the one with the larger caliber armament that would be appropriate for the real vehicle. And that's it for that. Oh, looks like there's one other thing on the bottom of the box, which is a length of steel cable. So that's excellent. As I mentioned before, on the other example, I had to use string to get this detailing over here. I'm not sure if I'm going to even use this cable because it is a bit on the stiff side, which makes wrapping it around a bit more problematic compared to the string. But one thing I do want to mention is that the eyelets over here are printed hollow, so that's great. Just, you know, put one end of the cable in place, and then you can go ahead and spool it and, you know, glue the other section where it needs to be. We'll see how it pans out if I use that cable or not, or if I just default to the string, because again, in my opinion, the string is easier to work with. But we'll see as the video turns on. Well, that's enough said over here. Let's go ahead and hop to the shop. And after not a whole lot of time, here you can see what the model would normally look like just before it would slide off into paint. What you see here is with the out-of-the-box condition, no more and no less. The components are very simple, as we saw before, and since everything is basically in a modular assembly, they go together very, very efficiently. From this point on, though, I am going to go ahead and make some modifications to the model, bumping up some of the detail, improving it from its standard condition, but we'll see how that happens as the scenes progress. But I just wanted to touch upon this point right now because this will give you a good baseline on what the actual model is like if you just build it with the out-of-the-box condition. Starting with the kit supply components, I first want to mention the 75. This unit here being a single print is awesome because it cleans up very well, and then once you remove all the little appendages from the printing sprues, the unit needs basically no hand fitting and just drops directly into place absolutely perfectly, nice and snug. It's very properly engineered in that regard. The unit, as you'll notice, is not glued on at this point because, as a quick pro tip, you need to thoroughly prime and paint the interior as well as also the under extremities here of the 75. And obviously once it's in this type of format, yeah, you're not exactly getting in there. So that's why this is something that's going to be best left for the final installation, basically at the very tail end of the build. Same is also going to be true for the tracks. If anyone has seen my T6 video, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So the tracks obviously are not yet glued on, and as I mentioned before, and as we saw earlier, the tracks are nice that they are a single printing. This is great. It cuts down on any sort of assembly time that really is required. The unit just simply plugs onto the kit supplied locations that you see here, which again, it's nicely engineered in that regard. However, one thing that I noticed about this kit, and this was the same thing that I noticed on the T6, is that the tolerances on the pegs as well as the corresponding holes are very, very snug. So snug, in fact, that if you just try to assemble it out of the box, you're going to run into some very tight tolerances to the point where you could potentially break something during the installation, be it on the inner portion over here, or even worse, you could break something on the pontoons, neither of which is ideal. So in order to work with this, the only thing you have to do is just to open up the tolerances here on the corresponding holes found on the pontoons themselves. This was done with a Dremel and a router bit, and I just simply went in there and just hand fit the components by just removing the amount of material required in order to get the piece to just drop in place, as you see here, without any fuss or any muss. Once the unit's painted and these parts are ready for installation, they just drop directly into this location over here, and once the adhesive's set, you're done, and you don't have to worry about these components ever again. And circling back to what I mentioned before about the paintwork, I need to loiter on this topic because this is extremely important, and it's probably the most important aspect of the entire build, because you need to thoroughly paint these things before they get fitted in place. And if you go ahead and build it like this and try to paint this thing, good luck trying to get into all these little recesses here with the primer and the paint. It's going to be tricky enough to do it in this format when it's removed off of the model. When the thing is fully secured in place, it's a fool's errand. You will have areas of exposed plastic, or in this case resin, and you will not be able to get the thing thoroughly painted. And good luck trying to get the tires painted. Again, it is not an ideal situation at all. And that's true for all tank models. But on something like this here, it is that, but compounded because of the setup, the way the kit is designed. The kit's built extremely well, but with the caveat, you thoroughly paint and weather everything prior to the installation. I cannot stress that enough. It is literally the most important aspect of the build. So with that out of the way, you'll notice that the tolerances again were done to both of the pontoons, and they just slide on directly in place. So with the side pontoons removed, it's now time for me to go ahead and start making some modifications to the model. I just want to stress, the kit itself is actually perfectly fine. You could just roll with it in this format if you don't want to go the next extra few steps. But with me being me, I do see some areas where the model can be polished up a little bit more, giving it a little bit extra detail and accuracy that'll really make it shine compared to just leaving it in this stock condition. Again, the stock condition is actually pretty good, and it's because it's so good, it gives a good canvas to go ahead and add upon it. But with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and take care of some things. So normally at this point here, this thing would be ready for painting. However, me being me, I am going to go ahead and make some extra modifications to this model just to polish it up more from the kit condition to further enhance it, to give it just a little bit extra more detailing and accuracy. First thing I am going to do, however, is I am going to go ahead and clean up the interior here where I removed those structure sprues that I mentioned before. As you can see, there are some nubs remaining, and it's best to deal with these at this time before it goes into the extra detailing phase. The next area I really want to focus on are the side hull details over here. We have the absence of the final drive detailing, as well as also we have some overly simplistic rear idler mount detailing over here, and this is something that's best taken care of at this point. And then, well, enough of me talking, let me just go ahead, skip to the next scene where all these details are modified. And then you can really appreciate exactly what was done. But before I do, I just want to again show what the model looks like in its stock format. And here's the model with all the mods made. At this point here, it's ready for painting. So just like with the other models that are similar to this, there are some things that are not glued on yet at this time. The tracks, of course, are one of them, as well as a little bit of mesh that we have right here for the engine grille. I'll go over that momentarily. So if I go ahead and take the tracks off again, as well as also remove the howitzer, or I should say, yeah, the little pack howitzer, you get a better look at the hull. So the first thing I want to mention is the cast texturing here, done to the 3-piece transmission cover. This here was done with Tamiya pavement paint, and it was basically applied on with the brush. I mentioned this in a few other videos. For some smaller scale builds like this, I like to utilize that technique as opposed to my red putty technique because it applies a bit thinner and you could have a bit more precision with the application compared with the putty or even the super glue trick. Once you build up a couple layers, once the paint goes on, it seals everything in place and it leaves for a very nice end result. In addition to the cast texturing, you can see how I added the final drive to this area over here. This one here is another spare component that I had in the spare box. It was spare from a Dragon 1/35 scale Sherman of one flavor or another, and I simply modified it for use on the vehicle over here. This, or I should say to use this, I had to shorten the stem slightly so that it fits onto the axle here, which will then allow the sprocket to slip on into place, and then it has the appropriate width, or I should say the appropriate standoff from the hull. And again, this will be much more better noticed once everything is completed, but here you get a good idea of what I'm referring to. Having this detailing over here greatly improves the model as opposed to leaving it absent. Circling back to the texturing, this is something that's going to be much more appreciated in the next scenes when the model's finished, because the model itself is all comprising of flat plates, which they're very smooth. They don't have any texture on them compared to cast components. So having the texturing on this section over here, it's a great way to add differentiation and a little bit more uniqueness to the build. Regardless, we carry on further to the rear idler mounts. These here, I added, again, some spare Dragon Sherman pattern of idler mount braces to either side here. The original ones just had that amorphous shape in there, and this was amputated with a high-speed removal bit, sanded away, and then I was able to add the new unit that we have here. In addition to the side plate, I also went ahead and added a little slit on the bottom portion over here, and this is, again, found on the real Lee and Sherman pattern of idler mounts, and it's how you would actually adjust the track tension. Or that's used with the fasteners, but I go into more information about that in actually my recent Jumbo video. So check that out in case you want to know exactly how these work. On the rear section over here, you can see I added some mesh to the inner portion between the exhaust manifolds, and this area would be open on one of these type of vehicles, so I went ahead and simply just cut some mesh that I had on hand and installed in that section, lickety-split. Moving up takes us to the taillights. The taillights that you see here are cast resin copies that I have on hand for use on Sherman projects, and this one here definitely fit the bill. The original lights were just basically a bulb as opposed to having the cat's eye detailing, so with the face swapped out with the cat's eye one, it definitely improves the look of the model, and this will again be more appreciated once everything is painted. In addition to the faces, you can see I added a little bit of wire to the taillights. Same was also done to the headlights over here, again just to add that little bit of extra detailing. Moving to the engine deck, you can see I added the tow cable, as well as also the tow cable mounts. Tow cable is some string that I had on hand from some kit or another, and I simply just mounted it in this location. The kit does supply you with a little bit of metal cable, but I didn't use that in favor of the string because it's easier to form the string into the shape that you want as opposed to the metal cable, which is a bit more stiffer, and I find it a bit more trickier to work with. Over there, or I should say in addition to the cable, I of course had to fabricate the little cable mounts. These are just flat pieces of soda can aluminum, cut to shape, bent, and then installed into the appropriate locations. On the shovel here, the mount was more geometric in shape, and if you look at a real shovel mount, it's actually smooth, so I simply just polished it down with some sandpaper, and it corrected the look that you see here. On the front of the vehicle, we have some modifications made to the tin work. Actually, a lot of modifications made to the tin work. First is with the thinness. As we saw before, the thickness on these parts were pretty substantial. Again, this is done for ease of ease of manufacturing, and also for a smaller scale model. 1/35 scale, you can actually have the parts a bit thinner, and it's more true to scale. To hollow this out, I utilize a Dremel with a high-speed removal bit, and I just simply remove very carefully the amount of material necessary to get the material that we have here. The kit also had some sort of a side skirt rail integrally printed on. This was amputated out, leaving for a nice smooth surface that you see. For the front portion, this is something that's typically seen on the M3 Lee and the early M4A1 type vehicles, where there was a bent section of the tin work that runs along the entirety of it. And this here was fabricated out of some thin strip of aluminum, cut to shape, glued in place, and it completes the look. On the top portion of the tin work, you can see that I fabricated the fender mounts. Of course, these are something that are very common on all of the Lee and Sherman pattern vehicles. Fabricated out of thin soda strip aluminum, or soda can aluminum, cut the shape, and then bent and fitted to the appropriate locations. Of course, once painted, it's going to look really great. On the top portion here, I had some half-round Plastrock stock, and I went ahead and bent it to the shape here, which will mimic the embossed rigidity sections that are present on these fenders here on these vehicles. Everything was cut to shape, fitted in place, blended in, and basically it's good to go. With the model fully completed, you get to see what it looks like with the suspension fitted in place. Like I mentioned before, the track paint work is going to be the most difficult and time-consuming aspect of this build, because with the way the tracks are rendered out, being all rendered out as a pontoon, trying to get in here and paint every single component appropriately and thoroughly
is definitely going to be a challenge. This is a challenge on most tanks that have obviously a pontoon type setup. However, on a Sherman pattern here, it definitely makes things a bit more complicated. Same is also true for the M3 Stewart pattern of vehicles as well, which SS Models does actually make quite a few variants and interesting range of. But as for this one over here, with the way the nature of these bogie housings are, trying to get into all of these nooks and crannies to make sure everything is thoroughly painted and properly painted is definitely a pain in the ass. It's much more simpler done before you glue the tracks to the vehicle. If you glue the tracks to the vehicle, good freaking luck. You're done. You're not going to be able to get the thing painted, and it's really not going to help you out. But even with the pieces off the model, it does make things a little bit more complex, but it's still doable. As for how many parts and what different type of parts need to be painted, let's go ahead and take a nice little head count of all the parts in question, just so you get an idea here on what I'm referring to. So, in order to paint what we see over here, you will need to paint the following items: the bogie housings, the return roller face, the idler wheel face, the rubber tire, the road wheel rims, the swing arms, the H-frame, the swing arm spring sections, the under swing arm spring sections. We also have the inner rubber pad, the outer rubber pad, the inner track tooth, the outer track tooth, the track tooth inner and outer sections on the reverse side, and you also have the sprocket tooth ring, the sprocket drum, and the sprocket tooth ring inner and outer on the reverse side as well. And not to mention, of course, you have to duplicate that because you have two of them to deal with. So as you can see, the paintwork on this is a real pain in the ass. And because it's an American vehicle, you have to paint all of these mentioned items, but you also have to be aware of their materials again, because you have certain items that are made out of rubber, certain items that would be polished from slight use, and other items that would be just scratched up and some metal showing from just abrasive type use. So there's a lot of stuff to consider and a lot of areas where things can go sideways. And although I am admittedly being slightly hyperbolic, this is, again, the most difficult aspect of this build, because the build, frankly, is very simple in the grand scheme of things. But, fortunately, it's not impossible. As you can see, I was able to navigate the orders quite well, and the pieces were painted without any sort of issues. The trick with the paintwork is you need to have all of the planets line up. You need to have the paints, most crucially, at the proper consistency. You need to have the proper tools to paint, i.e. for this case here, a good set of paintbrushes. And most importantly, you need to have the patience of a saint. If you're able to have all of these things, including a sprinkling of luck, you should be able to have no problems with the final outcome of your build. Now, I am going to go a little bit further into the paint aspect of it, but I'm going to put a pin in that for the time being, so I'm going to go over that later on towards the latter half of the video where I go over the remainder of the paintwork on the model, so stay tuned for that. But as for the tracks themselves, again, the kit supplied parts are decent, they do the job just fine, and for what it is, for this particular build here, they work fine for my needs. However, again, the biggest ding that I will say and argue that this kit does have, and same is going to be true for the other M2, M3 Lee, and even again the T6 kits from, well, not so much the T6, that has a slightly different issue with the track, but the other vehicles akin to this found on the SS Models catalog is again the over loose tension that we have here representing the tracks. And this is something, of course, that you can't fix because it's 3D printed as a single piece. In order to fix this, you are going to have to just delete and rip out the printed sections of track. You may be able to salvage the bogie housings. However, the sprocket, I doubt it's going to be able to survive such a procedure, as well as the rear idler. Fortunately, these components here are not too hard to come by, and if you built several Shermans, which chances are if you are working on this tank, you probably have a few of these components lying around loose in your collection if it's spare parts from one leftover build or another. As for the tracks themselves, again, VVSS Sherman tracks are ridiculously easy to come by in a multitude of materials, from single-piece vinyl to workable tracks from any sort of manufacturer, from metal to plastic, resin, 3D print. All those are out there and would be something that can be used on this build over here. And again, we'll have some nice-looking results, and it will be something that will be much more akin to the real one having the correct track tension as opposed to rolling with the kit one. But again, if you want to stick with the kit one, this is what it'll look like if you play your cards right. The one very last thing I do want to mention about the suspension before I depart, yes, it's just the one last thing I need to say at this time, involves the deburring of the tracks from the sprue that I showed earlier in the video. And that is with knowing what is part of the tank and what isn't. And although that sounds really simple and straightforward, on something like this can be a problem because you can get overzealous with your sprue removal and you might snip off something that you don't want to. And on this vehicle over here, this is relevant with the suspension. So if you look at the suspension, you will see these little rods that are connecting the two sections here of the swing arms. And on the real vehicle here, this was something that was seen on the M2 and some very early examples of the M3, where there was a rigidity rod that was found in this area over here and it bolted these two sections together. They are integrally printed on this kit over here, but at the quick glance and to the unknowledge, you'll take one look at this and think, oh, it's a sprue, and you'll amputate it off. And if you do, you kind of did an oopsie. It's not a bad one because, again, several other M3 leads later on just removed this piece altogether and they just had the piece without the rod in place. But if you are trying to render it and you see this piece over here, don't touch it, just leave it as is and just work around it with the paintwork like I did here. The SS kit is nicely rendered that all these rods are in the exact same location on every piece, and they are through and through, again, just like they would be on the real unit. So what I mean by that is that the rubber tire section is not integrally printed onto the bar or anything like that. The bar is a freestanding piece, so again, at least for some nice detail fidelity. But it's one of those things that you can easily see, not realize what it is, and make the wrong snip. So moving from the suspension brings us finally to the hull. And as I mentioned before, I went ahead and made some modifications to the idler mount section, replacing that amorphous molded in lump or printed on lump with a proper idler mount. And you can see a little glimpse of it over here, which is exactly what you want when you're looking at this area here of the vehicle. It's one of those small little modifications, but it's one that if you know a thing or two about Shermans and the Sherman family, it definitely makes the model look that much more polished. Same, of course, is going to be true for the final drive sections that I mentioned earlier. You really get to appreciate those detail sections. Specifically, if you saw it before without the sections in place, it just looks completely naked without these areas fitted. But once they are fitted in place, yeah, it definitely does a thing or two, and again, it makes the model look that much more polished. And while I have the unit in hand, I might as well pivot it upside down so you get to appreciate the detailing that was printed on the lower hull. Everything weathers out absolutely nicely on this model, and I'll circle back to that again towards the end of the video. And we also have the rear section over here where I added that meshwork that I also was referencing earlier in the video. And while in this section, you can also see the weathering done to the pepper pot exhaust. With the model placed back right side up, we'll go ahead and start with some of the rear detailing. So, starting with the mud flaps. The mud flaps that you see on this model here is a common mistake made on M3 Lee pattern vehicles, and it's made by just about every single person out there on the internet, on YouTube, and yes, even yours truly included. A lot of people, almost everybody, mis-IDs what these things are made of. To the casual observer who are building M3 Lees, you'll think that these things are metal. In fact, I used to make them out of metal in 1/6 scale. However, that is not true. The mud flaps are not made out of metal on the M3. They are actually made out of rubber. Now, before anyone chimes in, but John, I saw the Australian Armor Museum video on their M3 Grant, and it doesn't have rubber fenders. They are made out of metal. And yes, you are absolutely correct. Those ones are. However, those are the second pattern of rear mud flaps. When the vehicle was originally developed, it had this claw type of a mud flap that we have here, and these ones were always made from rubber. I actually found out by watching the old movie Sahara. Right in the beginning of the movie, it's on YouTube, check it out. You'll see the thing driving over a sand dune, and you will see a nice close-up of this fender here bouncing up and down because it's made out of rubber. It's even black, so it's not even painted. So yeah, the rear mud flaps on these things are rubber. And in order to render out your M3 Lee, it will be go ahead and best to paint it in a rubber black or just a flat black coloring. Or if you are going to leave it just overpainted with the green, that's obviously doable. If you are going to do that, you want to make sure you weather accordingly, do not rust or do anything along those lines. And if you are going to paint it with the base coat, you make sure that you're going to weather it, chip the hell out of these sections over here, because like I mentioned on things similar to this, like say on the M113, where it has those distinctive rubber side skirts on it, when the things get painted, the rubber will just chip the paint off almost immediately, the tiniest bit about a flex, and the thing will just Thanos snap out of existence, and you'll see the paint just brittling away. So if you are building an M3 leaf powder vehicle, bear this in mind. So much so that I basically have to update and refit all of my M3 leaves in my collection, including my 1/6 scale one, where I am going to have to swap out the tin work for rubber work, but that's a topic for another video down the road. From the rubber mud flaps brings us now to the taillights. Again, I referenced that I added the cat's eye detail sections, and now that you can see them painted, they really flesh out the model's rear section quite nicely. You know, the taillights always are an easy way to give an extra bit of color pop to the build. That requires almost nothing but carefully painting them. So when you're painting these taillights, as I always mention in these videos, the one here on the left-hand side, the cat's eye top portion is red. The bottom section is a little swipe of silver paint, and on the reverse side, the bottom is still silver, but the top portion is painted with a little swipe of gloss black. Right here in the middle section, again, we have that crank wheel cut out, and it just looks great while everything is finally painted. On the front portion, this takes us to the transmission cover, and again, as I referenced before, the piece had some cast texturing on, and hopefully it comes out on camera, but it adds some nice texturing and definition to the front section that really improves it from the smooth original print type layout that we had originally. The texturing came out absolutely perfect. It's not too aggressive, but it's not overly smooth, and it's right at the happy medium that you were looking for, specifically for an American casting. On the front sections over here, it takes us back to the drainage plugs found on the final drive areas. This little detailing, as I referenced before, is integrally printed on and is a nice bit of detailing that's supplied with these kits. The only thing you have to do as the builder is to paint it. You just take a little swipe of some red paint, add it right here to both of these sections to mirror image on the opposite side, and to further enhance it with some weathering, just a little swipe here of some gloss lacquer is really all that you need to get that nice little sweaty sheen that these little fittings here would undoubtedly get. Continuing along brings us to the front tin work, and again, all of those details that I referenced before that were fabricated out of aluminum are really paying off, including the side section that we have here, and it really just gives such a more scale look to the part compared to the overly chunky section that we had previously. Also, as I mentioned before, this was a very risky procedure that you can easily screw up, and if you do, let's just say your life is a bit more complex now. So again, as I may have referenced before, this is the type of procedure that you should only do if you have the skill sets and the patience in order to undertake. If you don't, you could probably best leave it chunky and just call it a day. But if you do, and those who dare win, you could go ahead and pull it off, and it'll have some excellent results, the final outcome. The other detailing that, of course, I added was that rigidity brace. That was, again, a really key focal point found in this tin work over here. And with it added and blended in with the paintwork and everything, it just looks awesome. It really does a fantastic job. Same is also true for the opposite side. Huge focal point on this build. Also, in this area here, you get to see the cable work that I added to the headlights. Same is, again, also true for the reverse unit. Just the little details like that are just what makes builds like this come alive. Even if the build is somewhat simplistic like this one here, it's those little final touches that always have a way on really making the thing that much special. Moving topside takes us back to the engine deck, and with everything painted and weathered, you get to see the final outcome of all that work that I was referencing before. And one thing that I do, again, want to mention on American tools specifically is that you have to properly paint the tie downs. And this is, again, one of those things that are given to you on the kits, either molded in or something along those lines, but a lot of people out there just tend to just overpaint them. And on a vehicle from this era, be it early World War II, the tie-down straps would either be made out of leather or they would be made out of a khaki type webbing material. So either way will work for your build. It just depends on your personal choice. Me personally, I like to use the khaki material just because with the tools being, or I render them with the wood being wood color, if you have the strap as a brown, it'll tend to blend in with the tool. So in order to add color contrast, the khaki is a good way to do so. And on the topic of tools, you have several options available, and I've seen these things in a multitude of different ways. From the entire tool being painted olive drab, to the head being olive drab and the handle being wood, to vice versa. There are lots of options available, so pick whichever one that you deem fit. But again, when you're doing so, just remember to paint the straps the color that would work appropriate. And again, if the things were all painted olive drab, well, then more likely I would go with a leather type webbing for the straps because, again, adds color contrast. Also, on this section over here, you get to see the work that was done to the shovel head that I mentioned before and how much it improves the model in its final outcome. And you also get to see the tools that have been carefully painted while on the model. This, again, is something that I generally do off the model on most builds out there. However, with this kit over here having everything integrally printed on, you're going to have to be slightly careful with your paintwork, but if you are, you'll be able to paint the tools without any sort of issues. Same was also true, by the way, for the tow cable. This was meticulously painted, and again, paint consistency and a good paintbrush are going to be paramount in order to make sure the paint goes where it needs to go. Also, in this section over here, you get to see the mesh work that I added to the top area. This is the same mesh that I added to the rear section, but unlike that one, which was added while the model was being built, this one here was added after the paint work was all concluded in order just to prevent the mesh from getting clogged up with layers of paint and varnish, which is something that can easily happen. And mesh work is something that's a bit of a trick, and it's a skill set in its own right when you're doing plastic model work. But if you're able to install the piece without the things getting clogged, you definitely did a fantastic job. And looks like I was able to, again, navigate those waters pretty well. Also in this section over here, you get to see the fuel cap rendering with the typical weathering that I do with the drippage. And if anyone's ever filled fuel caps on a piece of heavy equipment before in field, yeah, drippage is something that tends to happen more often than not. Also, on these vehicles here, it helps to know which fuel cap is for fuel and which is for radiator fluid. So the M3 is just like with the M4. These two here are the main fuel cells. This one here is for an auxiliary generator, and these two over here are for the actual coolant itself for the radiator. So when you're weathering it, make sure you render it accordingly, because if you have oil drippage on these guys over here, yeah, that wouldn't really work unless someone mis-ID'd which fluid goes where, and that's the case. Yeah, you got some bigger problems. And this now brings us to the interior, and the interior on this model over here did also need to receive some slight meticulous paint work. And the hardest part, or the most challenging aspect of this build, is trying to get the paint into these fine recesses here in the front, because just like with the suspension areas, a lot of nooks and crannies, and you're not exactly going to be able to get in there with the spray from the airbrush. So what I actually did was, when I'm priming the model and painting it, I actually went ahead and poured paint into the interior section over here, swirled it around a little bit, and then I poured the extra paint out. This was something that make sure that paint gets into all of the fine recesses, and it's a way to add paint very quickly on something like this. It is a specialty procedure. It's not the type of procedure that you'll use hardly ever, but it's one of those things where if you come across a situation like this, it's one that could pull you out of a jam. And as you can see, everything was thoroughly painted. The hardest part, though, of the paintwork was painting the instrument panel that we have right there, and also the inner periscope right there. It's really hard to get into frame. It's even harder to get in there with a damn paintbrush. Ask me how I know. But I was able to paint it as well as I possibly could, and I think I was able to do a pretty good job on it. But rest assured, this is one of the more difficult aspects of the piece. The seat is integrally printed on. I don't think I was able to actually get to paint the seat pads because it's physically impossible. But unfortunately, with the angle of everything, it's impossible to actually see the pads in general. But they are painted with primer and base coat, so everything does blend in. On this section over here, you get to see the fire extinguisher. This was carefully painted, some swipe of flat red, and also the funnel and the handle section were painted with a little swipe of flat black. The magazine section over here, the ammo racks, they were painted as well with a little swipe of gold leaf paint. Did a good job with that. And then on the rear section, we would have the radiator. So there are radiators found in these rear sections here. I believe it's for the engine oil on the Sherman pattern of vehicles and M3 Lee by extension. And on the Lee here, there is this, what looks like to be like a radiator guard, like you would see on an old apartment or an old house. and the piece was just simply painted. I should say the radiator sections were painted in between, and by doing this, it gives a good color contrast, and again shows a little bit of extra polish work done to the interior sections. On this area here, there's this storage box right over here, a nice little storage chest, and I went ahead and painted with a slightly different shade of olive drab, again just to add color variation to the piece, and it adds just again more variety and more contrast as opposed to leaving everything with the same color of olive drab. As another way again to add color contrast, I painted the straps here with the khaki color that I was referencing before on the tool post. All that helps to make everything a bit, again, more lively. Interior was painted and weathered, I should say, with some my usual weathering effects. Again, I'll circle back to that momentarily. As for the 75mm pack, again, just painted and weathered in my usual format. On the 75 pack, the breech block over here, it was painted with a swipe of silver paint, as they would be silver on the real units. And I also went ahead and painted the little square section right there in silver, as well as from the real examples I've seen, the whole block itself would be the same color, i.e. silver. The other thing to mention on the paintwork is the optic right over here. The small little lens right over there. A little swipe of gloss black paint was added. And the entire optic itself was also painted with Tamiya olive drab. Again, different shade of OD to add contrast. And if you've ever seen my other videos, namely my 1/6 scale M27 recoilless, it's the same exact optic, and those optics they tend to be this olive drab color, and the Tamiya OD works absolutely flawless for that. Comes on to focus, and again, adds color contrast, also a little bit of extra added realism to the build, and those things always are something that helps the build overall. Oh, and the little optic lens is painted over there as well. Again, this is where you would look into, and that's where it would see out of. One last thing I forgot to mention about the interior was I did have to slightly refine the leading edge on these two sections over here. With the way the unit was printed, there was this little weird wavy section found on these two areas. And this was something that can't hurt the look of the build, but fortunately it's easily polished away. This was polished away with a little bit of sandpaper and a needle file, and after a few swipes here and there in the right locations, the piece was squared away to the way we see it here, and it's much more presentable compared to the way it was originally. And that's all there is for the detailing. This takes us to the paint and the weathering. So straight out of the gate, before the model gets any drop of paint added to the surface, it needs to be thoroughly primed. And for the primer, this is something that I always advocate on these videos, because no matter the make or the type of paint you're using, be it Tamiya, Vallejo, or if it's enamel or acrylic or latex or whatever you're using, it needs to have some sort of primer surface added to the build in order for the paints to just adhere to in a much more easily done and effortless manner. And for me, I like to roll with flat black spray paint. Literally the cheapest stuff I can find is what I use on these builds. As I just mentioned before, it is very economical of a paint to use. Some guys out there like to roll with some kind of dedicated model primer of one flavor or another. Me, I like to roll with the cheap stuff. It just is more economical. When you build as many models as I do, you want to save money where you can and not affect quality. And fortunately, I have had excellent results with the use of the flat black as a model primer. So once the spray paint is added to all the surfaces, it's then time to add the base coat. For the base coat and the color that I rolled with this model, this is my early war shade of American Olive Drab, and this is the exact same color and paint that I've referenced in several other videos that I've done on vehicles similar to this in the past. Most notably, my 1/6 scale radio-controlled M4A4 Sherman and my 1/6 scale M3 Lee. In fact, this particular paint here, this exact bottle of paint, was mixed for my M3 Lee that I built all of those years ago, and I've been basically using it ever since. As for the paint itself, this is my tried and true method of using exterior latex house paint, which some people out there seem to get massively butthurt that I use that paint on my models regardless of scale, and I like the paint. It works great for me, and I have lots of success using it, and I will continue to use it till the sun falls out of the sky. So the paint itself is great. I mix a nice little color swatch, take it to the Home Depot. I get a gallon of the stuff for 20 bucks, and it lasts me basically forever. The paint is thinned out, diluted, and applied to the model surface via the airbrush. And this is for the majority of the paintwork, be it the interior as well as also the main sections of the hull. Airbrush was utilized, 1 or 2 coats, and I had build up the opacity layers to where I felt happy with it. Where the meticulousness of the paintwork came in play, specifically on this one, was with the suspension. And tying back to what I stated before, to paint the suspension, you can't use the airbrush on this. Because of the tight confines of all the parts here, the risk of overspray is just too much, and the airbrush is not the best way to go. So in order to paint these sections over here, I have to roll with a paintbrush. So all of the base coat that you see on all these surfaces was paintbrush applied. And just like with the tools, when you're paintbrushing, you have to have the right situation and the right ingredients in a row in order to get the thing to come out correct. Otherwise, you'll have brush strokes, you'll have just brush fragments in it. It'll be a mess. And yes, I've seen all these before in the past. First is consistency. The paint needs to be at just the right consistency. Like I was mentioning before with the tools. Too thick and it'll look like paste. Too thin and it'll run amok. Neither of which are doing you any favors. With typical model acrylics, this is more easily done. With exterior latex house paint, you have to really be on the ball a little bit more. Basically, the only side effect is that you'll have to build up the opacity in more than one layer. And it'll take more than one coat as opposed to modeling acrylic, which admittedly goes on a little bit easier and will go on more opaque in less brush strokes. With this one over here, you paint it on the surface. You walk away, you let it sit, you come back once it's dry, and you carefully paint it again. I think it was about maybe 3, maybe 4 coats total to get the opacity up to where I wanted it. But once that paint opacity was there, you were good to go. The bodywork, or I should say the base coat, not bodywork, the base coat was added to all of the components that would be tank. So again, this would be the housing, the swing arms, the wheels, all that. The hardest part was to actually paint the row wheels themselves, because unlike the other 1/35th scale Sherman pattern vehicles out there, there's no clear delineation between what's rim and what is tire. And this is very tricky when you're trying to paint. So the rims are actually painted freehand, believe it or not. I went in here carefully without losing my mind, and I carefully was able to paint the rims to the way you see it here. And I think for doing something freehand, I did a pretty good job, specifically having to do it on every wheel on both sides. Again, having the pieces off the tank is a huge benefit for this, and you will not lose your mind. The other thing to mention is with the track guide teeth themselves, or actually the sprocket, we'll go back to that, you have to really get in here and paint all of these recesses. And again, what you see here is all done with a paintbrush. It was tricky. It definitely was tricky, but I was able to pull it off. The other aspect of the sprocket that's tricky is you have to carefully paint the outer sections here of the teeth, so that when you look at the tank straight on, you can see teeth that are olive drab as opposed to just being blended in with other colors. Again, it's another way to get more accuracy and more realism out of the piece. After the base coat was applied to all the appropriate locations, it was then time to paint the teeth themselves. And for the teeth, I rolled with Tamiya Olive Drab. I always mention these videos, when it comes for these pattern of vehicles, you have some artistic licensing with the teeth. I've seen them in olive drab, I've seen them parkerized, I've seen them in a gray color. So you do have lots of options available, but I personally just like the aesthetics of using Tamiya Olive Drab. It seemed to just work on these builds. So Tamiya is what I rolled with. The Tamiya paint was applied after the base coat was added, of course, and the Tamiya paint is much more easily applied compared to the other stuff. But I was able to carefully go in here and carefully paint everything accordingly. The trickiest part is going over here near the guide horns, or I should say near the return rollers, as well as also into the sprocket area enclave. And the same is true for the interior portions as well. On the idler, again, you're going to have to be careful making sure you paint what's appropriate and make sure things don't run. If they do and you have a slight little oopsie with your brush, you can just go in there and touch it up with the other color and it'll blend in quite well. As for the rubber sections on the inner and outer portions of the track, this is the original flat black spray paint. So one advantage about this setup is that if you're painting around everything, you don't have to worry about getting any sorts of other color on the black sections, and you can just work around it, which is what I did here. The other thing to mention about the suspension is, again, being a Sherman powered vehicle, the idler and the return rollers on VVSS tanks are steel. They are not rubber rimmed. A common mistake I've seen far too many times on even some of the big channels out there. They paint them black. These are never, ever, 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 ever black. They would be either olive drab, but if the tank drives like literally 40 feet, it's going to rub right off, and you're going to have bare polished steel sections emerging. So for painting these, I went with just silver spray paint, the same stuff I use on my headlights here, and it was applied with the paintbrush very carefully in the appropriate manner in the right locations. You want to paint the face here. Obviously, this is what would get buffed pretty quickly with the rubber pads on the track, but you also want to carefully go ahead and weather the side sections, because obviously this is where the teeth are always sliding and rolling these areas over here, and the paint would roll off fairly quickly. Along that note, there's also the bare steel sections that would be found on the return rollers. Hopefully it comes out on camera, but there, that one there comes out pretty well. Ooh, right there. And again, meticulous paintbrush work at its finest. I cannot stress enough, your paintbrushes need to be on point. If you're using an old paintbrush that's been sitting in your paintbrush bin since 2003, yeah, you need to up your game. Those old brushes that start fraying, it's not going to do you any favors, and you're going to want to pull your hair out of your head. If you have a good set of paintbrushes or a fresh set, you should be okay. In this racket, you truly are as good as your paintbrushes. As for the other weathering work, this would include some dry brushing over here on these steel sections of the teeth, done to both sides. And the final weathering I did was a little coat of some diluted flat white via the airbrush just over the rubber sections, just to give that worn rubber aged look that we see here, which is something that would easily and most definitely be seen on sections like this on the real vehicles. Same type of weathering was also done, by the way, on the mud flaps for the same reason, and with use of the same paints. After the paint work and the weathering work was all done on the tracks, it was then time to mount it to the model. But before I did that, the remainder of the tank went through its remainder of its weathering format as well, which would include the use of the airbrush for some lightning effects, with the use of some diluted cream or white. I think it was cream on this one. Yes, I used cream. Diluted cream on some of the surfaces over here to get that sun-faded look. Then the model surfaces were counter-shaded, and for counter-shading, I actually used my I used the late World War II shade of olive drab. That was, again, diluted, and I added to the edges over here for some modulation. I also went ahead and used some diluted Tamiya flat black, and the remainder of the weathering work was done with the dry brushing. So dry brushing was added to all of the edges over here just to get the nice chipping effects that are generally seen on my builds. And on a vehicle like this where there's a lot of 90-degree and angular type angles, the chipping effects really do come out very nicely, and it helps a vehicle like this immensely. In addition to that, to me, a panel line accent is going to be your best friend. Of course, a vehicle with tons of riveting like this one here has more riveting than the Brooklyn Bridge is. Brooklyn Bridge doesn't have riveting, doesn't it? Oh, yeah, it does. Yeah. It's been a while since I've been to Brooklyn. Let's just say the George Washington Bridge. If you have that many rivets on it, the panel line accent is going to just help out immensely. It's going to hit all of these surfaces over here, suck into all of the panel lines, suck into all of the recesses around all of the rivets, and it's just going to make everything shine and pop, as you can see over here. Of course, the exact same weathering effects were done on the suspension as well, and the panel line accent is going to be instrumental with making all of these nice nooks and crannies on the suspension bogie housings pop out. For the interior weathering, again, same exact procedures were utilized with the exception of the addition of one extra step, and that was some silver on the dry brush to go ahead and scuff up the surfaces over here where the crew would walk around. Obviously, these areas here would get worn quite quickly from just general walking and operating of the vehicle, and the way you see it here was accomplished with, again, the dry brushing technique. The silver was only added to these areas and sections over here on the interior because, again, walking around on the outside, even though obviously it's done, it's not nearly as commonplace as and frequent as right over here on these sections. So it's one way to, again, make sure that the weathering is in proper context. For decals, you'll see that I didn't add any to this vehicle. If we saw photographs of the real T40, you'll see that this vehicle never got to the point where it would have got divisional markings or stars or anything like that, so I just went with that type of a format. I could have gone through my spare bin, see if I could have had some decals added to the model, but for this one over here, I just rolled with it markingless. Even though this vehicle doesn't have any markings fitted in place, I still went ahead and thoroughly coated the entire model with the VMS matte varnish, leaving for the end polished look that you see here. In the end, there's nothing much more I could have anticipated out of this build. This was a very smooth and effortless build from start to finish, and it's always great to start a build with a vision in mind, and at the end, it turns out exactly how you wanted it. And whenever you have that happen to you, it's always an awesome feeling. Like I stated, there were zero surprises or any other type of turn of events that happened during the course of construction, and this thing was basically, again, a smooth as silk process from start all the way to finish. And this is a perfect point to pivot us into skill level and recommendation. So straight out of the gate, if you are a beginner modeler, this is not a kit I could recommend for you, which sounds counterintuitive, specifically if we saw the beginning portion of the video where I go over the kit contents. The build itself is pretty much simplistic. It's only composing about like 3 or 4 pieces in all. So why is that a beginner is going to have a hard time with this, you may be asking? Well, the answer is not with the difficulty of the parts themselves, but with the material. Unlike a conventional polystyrene injection molded plastic model, this model here being made out of a resin material is one that does require a different type of skill set compared to your garden variety Tamiya. Unlike polystyrene, which is a very forgiving material, this resin material over here is very frail and brittle, and if you do not have your skill sets and your tools lined up properly, you're going to end up chipping, breaking, and just destroying all these very frail, fiddly bits, which will just snowball into a disaster of a build, and that's something that would be best to be avoided, specifically if you're a beginner. Unlike plastic model kits where more or less they're designed to fit together pretty well, and of course this does have some nuance to it. Some kits fit better than others, but by and large, when you remove a component off of a sprue, it generally tends to fit into the appropriate location pretty well. And on something like this here, that's not necessarily the case. A lot of times the pieces are very close to fitting, but they are going to require a little bit of hand fitting in order to get the piece to that final point where it fits in perfectly. And it's this type of a setup where a beginner is just not going to have those skill sets yet. So again, for a beginner, this kit here is most certainly going to be a no-go. This kit here I would recommend for anyone who's an intermediate to an advanced range builder, with the asterisk that you build things that are not just standard polystyrene injection molding. I met several people that refer to themselves as professional modelers, and they never touch anything besides injection molded plastic. If that's you, this kit here may be outside of your comfort zone, but however, there is something that is important to mention, and that is this is the perfect kit to practice on, because of the relative simplistic nature of the components over here. This does make the operator, or I should say the builder, hone in the skills on the basics when working with resin components, such as removing the parts off of the wafers, and also dealing with all of those appendages that we saw found on the printed parts in order to support the thing up and make it able for the machine to print it out. Several other kits out there are similar in nature but are far more complex, and if you do not have the skill sets in order to work on something like that, but you want to dip your toe into the water, so to speak, this kit here would be absolutely perfect for you. Because again, you get the feel of working with this material, specifically if you've never worked with one before, but it's not overly daunting where it's just going to potentially lead to a mess. This is a perfect kit for that. Also, as we saw, the kit does leave room for improvement on several aspects, many of which I've already addressed in this video, but just because I stopped where I did here, that doesn't mean you could pick up where I left off. There are several other details that the builder can potentially add to one of these kits over here to enhance it even further. Such examples, I could just say right off the top of my head, would be fleshing out the interior a little bit more. Because this is an M3 Elite Pioneer vehicle, of course, and does have all the riveting found on the exterior, but you'll notice that the inside is sparse with the interior portions of the riveting and the rigidity and reinforcement braces. Well, if you are so inclined, you could go ahead and scratch build these details here, and this will be another way to polish up the model, making it, again, just punch it well above its own weight. When it comes to these SS kits, they truly are just a blank canvas, and they really leave a lot of room for the builder's creativity to go ahead and manipulate it to any which way they desire. You could go conservative and just build it straight out of the box. You could go like what I did here, which is basically in the middle, or you can go on the opposite end and trick it out to the nines. And something like this is always a fun little project, again, if the juice is going to be felt to be worth the squeeze. Being an M3 Lee pattern vehicle, there are plenty of aftermarket accessories out there from a multitude of different materials, from polystyrene, photo etch, 3D print, turned aluminum. There are a bunch of things out there on the market that can be added to the model to, again, enhance it even further from what you've seen in this video. But this should give a good benchmark to basically what you can do with one of these kits. Also, the kit's quality is excellent in terms of the materials that it was produced in. Unlike several other lower-end 3D print kits that are on the market, where you see the surfaces and they are just plagued with print lines through and through, this model here, that's most certainly not the case. This thing looks like it's made from injection molded polystyrene. And if I didn't say that this was a 3D printed model kit, I'd be hard-pressed if anyone out there would have been able to tell the original material that this thing was made in. Which, again, it really goes to show the level that the technology is at right now, and it's just going to get better as time goes on. And having finished that sentence, I just realized we've crossed the threshold now into recommendations. So, from the get-go, if you are a fan of US military vehicles or World War II military vehicles, this kit's going to be recommended for you. Although, admittedly, this version here of the T40 is a fictional piece. It's not based on a real vehicle as far as I can tell, again, with the 75mm pack. Even with that in mind, it's still a really interesting and unique vehicle, and it's one that's definitely going to help your collection. Also, needless to say, if you are an avid fan of the M3 Lee or the M3 Grant pattern of vehicles, the addition of this kit here will definitely enhance that collection. And by extension, if you're just a ride or die Sherman guy, yep, this kit over here is definitely going to be recommended for you as well. Another person who I'll definitely not hesitate to recommend this kit to would be anyone who's an avid fan of, again, those MMO World of Tank type games. In fact, I believe this particular vehicle here is from World of Tanks, being with the Fictional Armament and all. If you love that video game, and perhaps you even like this vehicle in-game, obviously, this kit here has your name written all over it. The one person who I wouldn't necessarily recommend this kit to is anyone who's looking for a long, protracted build. This may sound strange to some people, but I do get emails sometimes for requests for kits out there that are, as they put it, get a good bang for their buck, so to speak. So you want a build where you start it, it's going to be an in-depth build where it has a large part count, and it's one that you want to pace yourself and savor every minute of it. That's you. Obviously, this is not going to be the kit for you. This thing is very, very rudimentary, very simple in terms of part count, and it goes together lightning quick. But on the flip side, if you are the type of person that are looking for something fast to build and just a carefree build, you want to start, finish it, and you don't really want to spend a whole lot of time on it per se, then something like this is definitely going to be recommended for you. Also, going back to what I stated before, this build, I had an absolute blast while working on it. Simple, sweet, it was just an overall pleasant build experience. And in the past, if you were looking for something like this here, your only option was going to have to scratch build it. And that's no longer the case with this kit here being on the market, being for the price that it's listed as, and also for the relative easy accessibility that this kit does have. Like I stated before, this is a thing that you're not going to find in your local hobby shop, so you are going to have to step outside your comfort zone if you're not used to buying stuff online. But if you are, well, welcome to current year, but it's definitely worth checking it out. And if this kit here piques your interest, I strongly recommend checking out the other kits in their lineup because, well, actually, you might not want to do that because it'll be wreaking havoc on your finances because they have almost an endless supply of really cool, interesting, bizarre vehicles that I've already done about a dozen or so of at this time, no joke. They're already done. They've been waiting for me to film them for a little while now, but that's something, of course, to come in the pipeline. As for what that is, you just have to stick around this channel to find out. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/35th scale US T40 GMC. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or the other larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as photographs of the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.